People cheer the axes and longships, but horror starts after the killing. Vikings grabbed Christian women alive because a living captive meant money, status, and control. Chronicles, graves, and slave hubs like Dublin back that up. Today, we pull the mask off. What Vikings did to captured Christian women was unforgivable, and the worst part comes after they survive. Why? The blade stops inches from her throat, and that pause changes everything. You expect death in a raid, yet she gets a worse deal. She stays breathing. A Viking stares at her face for a second too long. Then he checks her age. Then he glances at her hands, and you can almost hear the calculation. He sees a living body as sellable value, and that is why she lives. People around her fall in the street, yet she gets yanked aside, tied up, and treated like something that belongs in a pile. Do you hear how fast that happens? And how nobody asks anything? No one asks her name. No one asks where her family ran. No one asks if she will ever see her home again. The choice lands in seconds, and the label follows right after. Thrall. Property that can be traded, abused, or passed down like a tool. That word sounds clean, but the reality is forced ownership. Medieval sources make it clear that Viking raids on Christian coasts chased bodies along with silver. Captives, especially young women, sit right inside that business, and it keeps repeating because it pays. In some regions back in Scandinavia, slaves may have been around 10%. And that number matters because it points to a system that runs again and again. Ask yourself this: if 1 in 10 people were enslaved in places, how many raids had to keep feeding that demand? Historians digging through sagas, law codes, and graves keep finding the same pattern. Women taken in raids, moved into households, used for work and sex, with almost no exit. Some scholars even argue slave-taking paid so well that it helped fuel Viking expansion across Christian Europe, which turns the adventure story into something colder, profit-driving travel. Archaeologists have found women buried in Viking cemeteries far from where they grew up, and isotope tests show they came from Christian regions but died in Norse ones. That travel did not come from choice, it came from ropes and ships. Step back, and her story stops being a rare horror. It becomes a repeatable method. So when someone says, "They spared her," hear the truth. They kept her alive because her body could earn silver, children, and status for someone else. And now a quiet whisper on the deck decides which kind of hell she enters. The loudest moment of her life ends, and the quiet decision begins. A whisper carries more power than the swords did, and that is terrifying. If this story hits you, tap like, subscribe, and comment Part 2 so I know to keep going, because the next detail gets even darker. On the ship, the chaos fades, and men lean close to talk low, like they are picking a route, not a human future. She cannot understand every word, yet she catches the tone. Calm, practical, almost bored. That calm tells her she has turned into moving cargo. In a lot of Viking sources, women do not get long speeches, they get price tags. A young Christian woman taken from a raided coast could be tagged for a chieftain's household, handed out as a crew reward, or sent into export trade. That choice rarely comes from chance. Men look at age, health, beauty, and skills like weaving or spinning, because those skills turn into work, cloth, and status, and her body can be turned into children. That is the cold chain, work plus babies. Think about her position for a second. She is tied up, soaked, still shaking, and 2 men argue inches from her ear. They are not arguing about letting her go. They argue about whether she is too pretty to sell or too useful to waste on one farmer. That is the moment she learns a brutal lesson. She counts as logistics, and logistics get sorted. Historians use the word thrall, yet the lived meaning is a class of people who can be beaten, raped, traded, or killed with almost no legal consequence for the owner. Law codes from the period barely spend time on their rights. That absence tells you the point of the system: no real shield. This whisper also splits her road in two ugly directions. If she gets reserved for a powerful man, her life may last longer, yet it becomes watched and controlled, with private exploitation. If she gets marked for open sale, she walks into a market where strangers inspect her like livestock. The scenery changes, the harm remains, and every path ends in someone else's control. Here is what makes it worse. Historians and archaeologists argue that grabbing women like her fit into the Viking economy itself. Raids feed ships, ships feed ports, ports feed markets, markets feed households, and the cycle repeats. When the men whisper, they are following a familiar playbook. For her, that tiny moment becomes the cliff edge. She does not know the details yet she knows the truth. Her life is now a choice made by strangers. And the next sound, the oars hitting water, makes that choice permanent. A scream fades, and then you hear it. Splash, splash, splash. That steady sound means they are leaving, and nobody can catch them. When the oars bite into the sea, the ship pulls away, and every stroke adds distance between her and everything she knows. Christian chronicles describe towns and monasteries watching dragon-headed ships shrink into the horizon, and people on shore understood what that meant. Anyone taken aboard could vanish for good. For captives, the ship becomes a moving border, and once the coastline slips out of sight, the chance of rescue drops hard. That is distance as control. These ships followed routes that linked into trade. Some voyages fed into the Norse town that became Dublin, which turned into a major hub for buying and selling people taken from Christian Ireland and Britain. Other routes pushed east along river systems tied to the Volga and Dnieper, where captives could be sold onward to the Abbasid Caliphate or the Byzantine Empire for more profit. She does not know those names on deck, yet the crew rows like they do, because each extra captive means extra silver. That is profit in motion. Now notice the cruel part. The men rowing suffer too. Blistered hands, tired backs, aching arms. Yet their pain works for her captivity. Their effort moves her farther away from any family search, any local law, any priest who might even try to speak up. That rowing turns into a machine, and she is the product being carried. The quiet stretches hurt the most. No fire now, no shouting, only the rhythm of wood and water. And that rhythm gives her mind room to understand there will be no trial, no message sent home, no ransom offer so far. She was taken as inventory, and the inventory got shipped. That is silent certainty. Faith adds another twist. The farther they sail, the fewer people share her religion. Whatever thin protection a local priest or abbot might offer stays behind with the shoreline. Saints on church walls get replaced by carved animal heads on the prow, and nothing around her suggests mercy. Transport itself also erases witnesses. It wipes away the people who knew her, the place she came from, the proof of who did what. By the time they reach a harbor, she risks becoming anonymous, one more Christian thrall from a successful raid. Behind her sits smoke. Ahead of her sits unknown. And once they land, they take something else fast: her name. They steal her freedom, and then they steal her name right after. That second theft sounds small, yet it hits like a punch. When they drag her off the ship, someone tries to say her name, says it wrong, laughs it off, and replaces it with something Scandinavian that fits his mouth. That is one of the quiet tools of slavery that repeats across history, erases the old identity, and writes a new one that points back to the owner. In Viking Age Scandinavia, thralls often carried names that marked them as unfree or foreign. and some were labeled by jobs or insults instead of real personal names. That rename becomes identity erasure. Think about what her old name carried. It tied her to parents, godparents, a village, a church, maybe a saint's feast day she grew up with. It gave people a handle to pull her back into the community. The new name cuts that handle off and ties her to one thing only: the man who owns her and the place he keeps her. That is ownership branding. Scholars talk about owners constructing slave identities, and you can see it happen in one sentence. A man decides the syllables she must answer to if she wants food, sleep, or fewer beatings. No papers show up. No ritual happens. Power alone makes it real, and she learns fast that answering to the new name becomes a survival skill. The rename also broadcasts her status to everyone nearby. Free people hear the new name and instantly clock what she is: foreign, unfree, lower than them. It tells them how to speak to her, how to order her, and how to treat her body as available for labor. That is public marking. Later, people romanticize Vikings as rugged heroes, yet this part rarely enters the highlight reel. It is hard to sell heroic epics while a terrified woman gets rebranded like livestock. Yet skipping the renaming skips the point. The system needed to break her inside as much as chain her outside. Once the new name sticks, it travels. Neighbors use it in gossip. Children shout it when they want work done. Traders write it down if she gets sold again. Her real name shrinks into something she might whisper at night like a prayer: careful, quiet, private, because if anyone hears it, they can laugh and remind her who she is now. And then she hears something that tells her the house has its own rules. A soft laugh lands, and she understands what comes next. A scream makes sense in a raid. A laugh inside a house means this harm feels normal to someone. The first time a man laughs while she is scared, it hits harder than a slap, because it tells her he feels safe doing this. Modern scholars of the Viking world are clear on one thing: women were taken for more than farm work. Female captives were routinely used as domestic and sexual slaves, and one historian warns people against underestimating how much buying and taking women for sexual purposes fit into the system. That sounds clinical on paper, yet in a room with a locked door, it becomes forced sex. Back in her Christian community, she grew up with lines that mattered, and even if those lines were weak, the idea existed: shame, condemnation, social pressure. Inside this household, those lines vanish. The man who owns her controls food, sleep, clothing, work, and her body. No priest is coming to stop him. No local law stands between her and him in any reliable way. When he laughs, she hears the message, "This is routine." And routine becomes its own terror, because routine means repetition. Watch the rest of the house, because their reaction teaches her what survival looks like here. Older women do not rush to protect her. Some of them may have lived her story years earlier, taken in raids, now surviving as half-respected partners and half-prisoners. They know open resistance can bring worse punishment, and that knowledge pushes silence into the room. That silence becomes trained fear. Later sagas often skip these details or push them into the background. A hero takes a woman in one line, and the story moves on. Yet that one line can cover years, pregnancies she never chose, children born into a world where their mother is property, constant fear that a bad mood turns into a beating. Archaeology supports the human movement too. Foreign-born women show up in Norse settlements, their teeth and bones pointing to childhoods in different lands and deaths in Scandinavian ground. Put that together with the written evidence about concubinage and thralls, and the picture gets ugly. Whole generations of Christian women got folded into Norse households as unwilling partners and silent labor. The soft chuckle carries confidence, the confidence of repetition. Then she hears another kind of whisper, men trading favors. And that is where her life becomes a promise between strangers. The worst part is when the violence stops and the deals begin, because deals sound polite while they destroy someone's life. One night, she hears men lower their voices again. This time, they are not talking about raids or fighting. They are talking about favors, alliances, debts, and who owes who. In the Viking world, power grew through networks, chieftains and ambitious farmers making deals for ships, support in feuds, and future raids. Inside those deals, enslaved women could be used as bargaining chips. A man could offer a Christian thrall as a gift to seal loyalty, or promise her as a concubine to sweeten an agreement. That turns her into deal currency. Scholars writing about polygyny and concubinage in Viking Age Scandinavia point out that extra women in a household could signal wealth, reach, and connections. Being able to say, I have women from Ireland, from England, from Frankish lands, worked as a flex, because each woman represented a successful raid, a route that worked, or a powerful tie. So when she hears them talk about her, she hears her life shrinking into a clause in a spoken contract. Do you notice what they call her? They avoid her name. They use the Christian girl, like she is an object that can be moved to help men climb a ladder. Maybe the man who owns her wants to rise in status, so he offers her to a more powerful neighbor. Maybe he needs to pay off a debt. Either way, the deal helps men move up, and she moves only as a piece. That is status trading. The sick detail is how many times this can happen. A woman taken in a raid might pass from owner to owner across a lifetime, each one treating her as a prize, a gift, a tool. From her side, it means new rules, new risks, new hands, and no choice. Later storytellers can dress this up as alliance building, as if offering a woman is like offering food. Yet sources keep circling the same pattern. Women from Christian lands ending up as secondary wives or concubines in Norse households, their presence proving a man's reach and ruthlessness. By this point, nobody even pretends she has a say. Then the ship hits a harbor, and the harbor turns into a sorting machine. Land shows up, and you expect relief. She steps onto the dock, and it feels like a marketplace for human futures. When the ship noses into a harbor, the scene looks normal from far away. Smoke from houses, people moving around, voices, trade. Up close, for her, it functions like a sorting station. Some Viking ports doubled as slave hubs. Places like early Scandinavian Dublin grew rich as centers where human beings were bought and sold, many taken from Christian Ireland and Britain. Other harbors linked into wider trade routes stretching toward Eastern Europe and the Middle East, where captives could be sold again for more silver. That first stop becomes sorting day. For her, that means another round of silent judgment. If she looks strong enough for farm work, someone may decide she fits a local household. If she appears especially young or attractive by their standards, they might hold her for an elite buyer or export. If she looks injured or sick, the calculation turns colder. Is she worth feeding and healing, or should they cut losses? That logic turns survival into math, and she is the number. That is a cold evaluation. Historians and archaeologists have started mapping these economies of unfreedom, showing how repeated raiding filled ports with captives who then flowed outward like goods. It is not a few unlucky women. It is a river of stolen lives passing through familiar choke points. The harbor looks calm from a distance, yet it works like a machine up close. She may not know the place name, yet she can read behavior. On the open sea, men could relax because control was total. In harbor, they grow sharp and busy, counting, talking fast, thinking about prices. Even small movements tell a story. The way they pull her forward, tuck her behind others, or adjust her rope positions her for sale or display. That is staged captivity. The worst part is the crowd reaction. Local traders, townsfolk, visiting merchants, they have seen scenes like this before. For them, it is market day. For her, it is the moment her future forks based on strangers who might forget her face tomorrow. And then it happens. A buyer steps close and smiles. That smile makes her fear focused, sharp, and personal. Fear stays blurry until someone picks you out of the crowd. One smile turns the whole market into a personal threat. Written sources and modern research describe captives being traded across an area stretching from the British Isles to Russia and beyond. Women held high value inside that trade, and Christian women taken from raided coasts could end up in Norse towns, on remote farms, or trafficked farther along rivers tied to the big markets of the Islamic world and Byzantium. That reach matters because it means she can be moved again and again. That is wide slave trade. A man steps in front of her and smiles too wide. He is not checking whether she can carry water. He studies how she might look inside his house, how quickly she might bear children, how easily she can be controlled. In some societies linked to these roots, light-skinned Christian women were treated as exotic status symbols. The same background that once framed her as ordinary now becomes part of her price. That is status buying. What makes this moment brutal is how normal it feels to everyone else. Other buyers glance, haggle, move on. Traders talk about scars, strength, and skills like they are discussing horses or tools. Somewhere in that noise, a final price lands, hands clasp, and her rope passes from one hand to another. No ceremony, no appeal, just a transfer. That is a rope sale. Historians talk about profiles of captives, where they came from, what work they did, how long they lived. Those profiles can sound tidy until you picture what happens here. A real person watching her future lock shut. The buyer's smile feels specific because his plan is specific. Maybe he wants a concubine to show off. Maybe he wants a house slave who also warms his bed. Maybe he wants someone he can threaten to control others. Whatever story he tells himself, she gets no voice inside it. The market moves on fast after the deal. People turn away. Trade continues. Her life has changed, and the crowd acts like nothing happened. So she grabs the only private thing she can still control, her faith. She traces a cross, and she learns fast that belief alone cannot protect her. She keeps one secret, small enough to hide in plain sight. A cross traced on skin, done quietly, because it is all she has left. Some nights, when nobody is watching, she traces a tiny cross on the inside of her wrist. It gives her a private anchor, a way to hold on to who she was before ropes and markets. For Christian captives, faith could feel like a lifeline, something an owner cannot fully reach. Yet faith could also become a new weakness. Vikings knew that ransoming important Christians, bishops, abbots, nobles could pay well. Yet an anonymous woman from a burned village or small convent carries no powerful rescuer searching for her, and that reality leaves her stuck. There is no rescue network. Medieval churchmen condemned slave-taking, especially when their own communities were hit. At the same time, Christian societies around them also practiced slavery, and sometimes bought captives back only to keep them as servants themselves. That contradiction matters because it kills the simple rescue fantasy. If she ever gets near a priest or monk and asks for help, what happens? She cannot count on an answer that saves her. Her owners might mock her belief, pressure her to adopt their gods, or ignore it as long as she obeys. Refusing rituals could bring punishment. Showing loyalty to Christian symbols could make her look rebellious. So the cross she draws with her fingertip becomes safer than any object, because they can take objects, yet a gesture slips through. That is a hidden prayer. Historians looking at law codes and church texts see the messy reality, sermons against kidnapping Christians sitting beside records of Christian elites owning slaves, including women taken in war or bought in markets. That makes the symbol painful. The cross once promised protection. Now it mainly highlights how unprotected she is. Chroniclers recorded kings, raids, and miracles, not the quiet defiance of enslaved women praying in languages their owners ignored. So her resistance risks getting erased from the story. And that leads to the final twist, because silence helps someone. The real question becomes, who gains the most when she stays quiet? This story has a brutal ending, and it is not one escape scene. The ending is a whole system that keeps paying people for generations. Most women like her never get a clean ending. No dramatic return home. No revenge that resets the damage. Historians tracing the Viking diaspora through texts, archaeology, and DNA keep seeing foreign-born women folded into Norse communities, their descendants blending into the population. Genetic work on Viking Age burials and places like Iceland shows a strong Gaelic female component in ancestry, matching what we know about Viking raids on Christian lands. That changes the settler story, because it points to captive women becoming ancestors. So who benefits from her silence? Start with the men who owned her. Their status rose with every extra worker and every child in the household. A captive Christian woman could milk animals, weave cloth, work fields, bear heirs, and still get described simply as a woman he had taken, with no need to explain the violence behind that phrase. That is status built on her life. Then look at the wider economy. Slave raiding and trading pumped silver and goods into Scandinavian ports and into markets across Europe and the Middle East. Captives like her were the moving parts of that machine. Every time she got bought, sold, or gifted, someone climbed a notch in wealth or influence. That is silver from bodies. Then comes the part that stings today, later storytellers. Sagas, chronicles, modern TV shows, tourist brochures, and many versions of the Viking story skip women like her, or soften them into wives and lovers. The cleaner the legend, the easier it sells. Give it a few generations, and the children of captives become locals. Ports built on slave money become historic towns, and the violence becomes background noise. That is why this topic hits so hard. It forces you to see the Viking legend sitting on stolen lives. Once you see that, long ship symbols and heroic feast stories feel different, because you can hear the silence under them. And here is the last hook to sit with. If one famous legend hides this much, how many other legends